and then we'll have a panel discussion for anybody that has any questions. And so what I thought I would go over today is looking at chemotherapy and some advances in clinical trials. Certainly anybody that shows up at any of our clinics will be approached with the concept of clinical trials, and I think often it's overwhelming and difficult to understand what truly is a clinical trial. What are we looking at? What are we looking to achieve? Why participate? What do you have access to? And I hope that we could highlight that today. And so we've mentioned that sarcomas constitute a really vast group of rare solid tumors with very distinct clinical pathological features that really get divided into two categories, and that's the soft tissue sarcomas and bone sarcomas. All of us that have spoken today really focus on both of these. Often we talk a lot about soft tissue sarcomas because they're much more common in adults, but we see a wide range and we do research in both areas. So collectively, it's about 1% of the adult malignancies. Our tumor boards are also frequented by the pediatric physicians, and we do review those cases, and sarcomas are about 15% of what the pediatric population sees. So the Northwestern approach is a unique approach. Obviously, it gets replicated or can be found at other large centers, but we are very proud of what we've created here. Hopefully, what you've heard today is that everyone is very passionate about what we do. We come to work excited to be at work. We enjoy working with each other and working with all of you. And so what we do have is an integrated surgical and medical oncology sarcoma clinic that runs on Tuesdays and Fridays. We see patients Monday through Fridays, but on these two specific days, you could be seen by both your surgeons and your medical oncologist, as well as radiation oncology. At any given time, we try to have a complete and comprehensive clinical trial portfolio so that for any patient walking in the door, we'd have options that are beyond just standard of care options. We have a robust exposure nationally and internationally, so everyone has talked about these NCCN guidelines, which Northwestern is a founding member of. All of us sit on panels, so everyone who's spoken tonight sits on a panel and helps dictate the care of patients around the world. We are members of CTOS, which is the Connective Tissue Oncology Society that meets once a year. We're members of the AJCC, which is the staging manual on how we stage cancers. We work with Alliance, which is an organization that does run clinical trials on rare tumors, including sarcomas. And we are members of SARC, which is the Sarcoma Alliance of Research Collaboration. So we really try to have our hands into every organization nationally and internationally that is really changing the face of sarcoma research. We are also a founding member of the Midwest Sarcoma Trials Partnership, and therefore open up clinical trials through this consortium with Mayo, WashU, and University of Iowa, as well as Wisconsin. So if we look at our clinical trial portfolio over the last several years, the protocols on the left are protocols that a number of you may be familiar with. And essentially at any given time, we try to have open between 10 and 12 clinical trials. We try for the trials to not overlap too much, but certainly give patients opportunities that if one or two trials don't work, there are still other options for clinical trials for them. Over the last several years, we have screened 218 patients on these clinical trials, and 174 patients have participated in clinical trials here at Northwestern through our clinics. All of these listed here are treatment trials, and so we haven't looked at other trials here besides the treatment trials. And so what is a clinical trial? So when you walk into the door, and if we talk about treatments, I usually talk about that you could have standard of care options and you could have treatments that are on clinical trials. So clinical trials are carefully designed medical research studies conducted with people that test promising diagnostic, treatment, and prevention methods, and we're really trying to answer scientific questions. There's always a question that you're trying to answer, and you construct the trial in order to achieve the benefit, hopefully. So we run pharmaceutical corporation trials, or we work with the pharmaceutical corporations to work on investigating new drugs. As an academic medical center, we approach pharmaceutical companies that have compounds that we want to use, and we request the use of the drugs and therefore create investigator-initiated trials. And these would be trials that would predominantly be run at Northwestern, and then maybe one or two other sites nationally would join us in order to get enough patients on the trials. And then we also work through the National Cancer Institute using the cooperative groups, and Alliance was one of the groups that I mentioned. SARC is another group that we work with closely. So interventional trials are looking at treatment and prevention. A lot of times you'll be asked to participate in quality of life questionnaires to really get a sense of what is happening with how are you doing. And the questions that are asked are simple questions, but they provide an in-depth amount of information, certainly information about mood, function, depression scores, anxiety, and quality of life. And some of the trials that we run here are screening trials as well. So clinical trials are important because we only know how to treat people today based on the information that we have from clinical trials. And therefore, we're looking to advance the standard of care of cancer treatments. We're looking to understand disease processes, and we're looking to get FDA approval so that more drugs will come to market, and patients who don't have access to clinical trials or access to large academic centers still get access to drugs. So what have we learned? Well, we certainly learned over time by including all races, all ethnicities, all genders, that race, gender, ethnicity can be a risk factor for certain malignancies, and it's only through clinical trials deriving this data that we're able to figure this out. There's the Human Genome Project from 2002 that was discovered by clinical trials, and all emerging therapies leading to targeted treatments with fewer side effects. So a lot of the trials we offer now are not chemotherapy-based treatments, but they are targeted therapies or immunotherapies. So there are certain stages in development in medicine, and a lot happens behind the scenes. We have a number of labs here at Northwestern that people are looking at new compounds. This is testing lab-based research on cell lines, and subsequently you could do animal testing to look at compounds, and then it goes into clinical trials in humans. The only clinical trials that we would conduct and offer here are phase 1 clinical trials that are most often done through the Developmental Therapeutics Institute. We run phase 2 and phase 3 trials predominantly at Galter. And then phase 4 trials are post-marketing trials that traditionally are not done here. So the phase 1 study is our first studies in people, and it's really to test safety of the drugs. The drugs hopefully will work, but the question that's being asked is what is the maximum dose that we could use that is safe for patients without too many side effects? When we look at phase 2 studies, it's likely because we found in phase 1 that there is a signal of activity, or in a lab it makes sense to try this drug in patients with sarcomas. And for those we're looking, is the drug effective? And defining effective is based on a % of patients that will do well for a certain amount of time, and it's predetermined. And the answer that comes from this will be yes or no. If the answer is yes, the drug then is reviewed in phase 3 clinical trial, which compares an investigational drug with what is considered standard of care. And standard of care is usually predetermined. Most of us know what standard of care is, but sometimes there's a little flexibility about which drug compounds we could use. And phase 4, as I said, is ongoing safety data, which is post-FDA approval, and unlikely that you'd be presented with one here. So the way the process of clinical trial initiation works here at Northwestern and any NCI designated cancer center is that the protocol is submitted to the academic center, and before it goes to the university for review, it has to go to the cancer center for review, and that's the scientific review committee who will look over the protocol, look over the consent form, look over the investigational brochure to ensure that the scientific integrity of the trial is in keeping with patient safety and in patients' best interest. It then goes to an institutional review board, which is a group of physicians and non-physicians who are looking at the integrity, once again, of the study, looking at the ethics of the study, and looking to make sure that these consent forms that you're presented with make sense, and that the consent forms are, in lay people's terms, able to be easily comprehended for everyone. And then once that gets done, there is trial initiation. So the trial is officially open, drug comes to site, and then we could start accruing patients onto the trial. So there are a lot of myths about clinical trials. One that often gets done is that patients are concerned that they may receive a placebo instead of an active treatment. And so it is impossible to receive a placebo unless you are told that part of the trial is looking at placebos. So I would say currently about 90% of our trials are drug trials that do not incorporate placebos, and maybe about 10% of our trials that we run at any given time have placebo. At this point, placebos are rarely used in cancer clinical trial unless there is no established standard of care, or if the thinking is that the disease that's being evaluated doesn't urgently need to be treated, and that there is time to wait to see whether or not drug is more effective than no drug. And so there are a lot of trials that are done per year, but it really is a very small fraction. You would not be presented with a placebo trial if there was any concern that the tumor was too aggressive to allow you the time to receive a placebo trial. So the next myth is that clinical trials are not safe. And so each step in drug development is very regulated to ensure the safety and protection of research participants. It is possible that the drugs themselves may not have all the safety that we've known about. Certainly in phase 1, we could uncover things. You could uncover new things in phase 2 and phase 3 as well. The trials themselves are deemed safe because otherwise we would not be doing them. But certainly we need to follow order, make sure that patients come back in our routine visits, make sure that we're capturing all the information that needs to be captured. If you're having a side effect, you need to call us and tell us about the side effect. And that's the reason for anybody who's on a clinical trial that we ask so many questions, because we certainly want to tease out to make sure that there is no harm being done. And certainly that we're able to capture all the side effects so that when we present consent forms to people, that everything is listed fairly. And the thing to remember is that the only way we know how to treat people today and every drug that is offered is really based on these clinical trials that we've had in the past. The myth number 3 is that if you consent to a clinical trial, I lose the chance to receive more effective standard treatments. And so standard treatments are always available to patients. There is no restrictions in availability. Participation in clinical trials is voluntary. At any given time, participation can be withdrawn. You don't need to stay on it. If you were on a clinical trial and the FDA approved a new drug and it looked more impressive, then certainly you could be pulled from the clinical trial at any given time to go on a more effective therapy. Being on a clinical trial should not hinder or affect negatively anything that you receive. And so the purpose of the trial is actually to gain something added, and so it certainly should not be punitive. Another myth is that participation in a clinical trial means that there's no hope. And so this is a horrible myth. Traditionally, clinical trials are available at all stages and all levels. So we talk about first line, second line, third line, fourth line treatments. First line treatments are usually treatments that we would define as for patients who have never received a chemotherapy before. Second line is if the first treatment didn't work. Third line is if the second treatment didn't work, and fourth line obviously is if the third treatment didn't work. And so what we try to do at least is open up several trials that would capture all patients. And so we try to have first line trials, we try to have second line trials, third line trials. And so our ability to offer trials to patients who are what we would call chemotherapy naive, so never having a chemotherapy, is really, the purpose is to try to improve upon what we already have. And it certainly does not mean that there's no hope. It means the opposite, is that there's a team of physicians and scientists that are eagerly looking to improve your outcome. And we think that attacking it as early as possible would impart the best outcome for you. So how does one enter a clinical trial? So it is true that everyone is not always eligible for a clinical trial. It is very difficult. I showed you on the earlier slide the number of patients who have been screened and the number of patients who have participated. Some of the screened patients didn't want to participate, and that's why the numbers are lower. But some of the screened patients were not eligible once we went over eligibility criteria. And so what we would do in the clinic, including the entire behind-the-scenes clinical research office, is screen people before we offer you clinical trials. And the screening process is essentially to look that you meet the criteria for the trial based on information in the chart. So based on how old you are, based on how well you are at home, how functional you are, based on the histology of your cancer, the stage of your cancer, what we're able to see with your cancer. But then once you get into the office and we present you with the clinical trial, there are other things that we can't predict for. And so the eligibility criteria changes a little bit, and you may go for a lab test that would then make you ineligible for the trial. And so there are some pitfalls and some disappointments with it. When we present you with the informed consent is supposed to be an opportunity to learn about the benefits and side effects. It is not a contract. You're not signing away anything. It's more of an open dialogue and an opportunity to move forward with what we would consider an exciting treatment possibility. And it really is to open up a dialogue between yourself and your clinical teams. So the benefits of clinical trial participation is that you gain access to advanced treatments. You potentially have extended treatment options. So if we could come up together with 5, 6, 7 different treatments for any given patient, this then extends that to 8, 9, or 10 different treatment options for them. The study treatment is usually given at no cost, and that could potentially be a benefit for patients. You're contributing to the advancement of medicine. We are where we are today because of patients, and we wouldn't know what we know if patients weren't participating in trials. So there are potential risks associated with clinical trials, and those include unknown side effects of the study treatment. And for anybody who's been on a clinical trial, obviously everything you read in these consent forms will tell you about the side effects, but until you have a side effect, it's very hard sometimes to perceive what this truly means for you. Often in these trials, you have additional time that you would be required to come. So we do run a few phase 1 clinical trials that would mandate someone showing up every single day for blood tests for a 2-week period. And that's very different than coming 1 day for treatment and not coming back for 20 days. So there usually is a time commitment that is increased, whether it become a longer day, so you have to stay 8 hours later so we could do an EKG or do an extra blood test, or whether or not you have to come back the next day for an extra blood test. And as with anything, the study treatment may be ineffective. But having said that, you've never been presented with FDA-approved drugs with the guarantee of effectiveness. And so if we knew that there was a drug out there that would be 100% effective, one would never offer a clinical trial. We offer the clinical trials because we know that the drugs we have currently are flawed, and we want to increase what we have available. So who is watching out for patients' interests? So for anybody who's been on a clinical trial, I usually review the last few pages and tell you that your information is kept private, but when you're on a clinical trial, there are added people who have access to your medical records and charts, and those include the FDA that could come in and audit to make sure that the trial is being conducted properly and that you are being treated fairly. The NCI could audit your charts as well and receive information. The Institutional Review Board does audit and looks at these clinical trials once a year, and they do have a mandate that could increase that to every 3 months or every 6 months if there are concerns. And the physician and investigators are reviewing all patient cases. So any patient who is on one of my clinical trials, whether or not I'm the treating physician, I will constantly review the data to make sure that the integrity of the trial is done and that patient safety is maintained. So essentially what questions you want to ask when you go to the doctor's office, certainly bringing a pad and paper and being prepared for some of these visits is important. Some of the visits are 20 minutes, some of the visits are 40 minutes, some of the visits are 60 minutes. Without a doubt, no matter how long you spend in the doctor's office, you leave and there are questions that are unanswered because there are questions that have not been asked. And the 60-minute visits probably feel very rushed. The 20 minutes visits feel very rushed. There certainly is so many questions to ask, and coming prepared is helpful. Some of the key questions to know is, what are my other options? Those are always a good question. If you're being presented with one thing, it usually isn't just that you have one option. You usually have 2 options. I'll present to you, or any of us will present to you what we think is the most medically sound option. If there are several options and they're all equivalent, we'll present them all to you. But certainly asking what your other options are is very good. If we're talking about clinical trial, it's important to know who put the study together. So who is the sponsor, whether or not there's a conflict of interest between the physician who's treating you and the sponsors. What will you get out of the study? So what are they looking to achieve? Are they looking for toxicity to know if the drug is toxic, or are they looking to know that patients live longer? Most patients want to know that the endpoint is living longer or having the disease respond to treatments. How long will the study last? So what is your commitment to the study? If the study drug is working, are they going to kick me off the study? So there are patients that have been on study drugs for 3+ years, and certainly it's important to them to know that the study drug isn't going to become unavailable to them. So they want to be able to have access to these drugs. You certainly want to understand the risks. You want to understand the cost. And so every study is a little bit different. All studies will charge your insurance company standard of care procedures, but certainly some companies will give you the drug for free, some will not, some will give you other stuff, and so it's important to know what's involved. And then what tests are involved. Certainly you want to know how frequent the tests are being done, how quickly you're being monitored, trying to really tease out what would your physician consider standard of care versus added testing, because that will make a difference for you. So how do you find clinical trials for sarcomas? And so certainly asking your doctor for help is a brilliant way to start. You could reach out to any academic medical center in your area, and you could go online to www.clinicaltrials.gov. It is relatively user-friendly to go through. You would put in your diagnosis and you could sort of peruse what's available. Having said that, you are perusing and you could be looking at clinical trials that are done anywhere in the world. And so even this afternoon, I looked through one, and then you're able to pull up studies in China that are not applicable and Europe, which is not applicable. So you may need a little bit of time to look through it and really see where these trials are being conducted. So this is the site. When you pull it up, this is what you end up seeing. And in the box over here is where you would do your search topic. After you put in sarcoma, it will give you a list of all clinical trials. There are tabs that you could link that you would probably want to eliminate trials that are currently not accruing patients, and tabs where there are where the clinical trial is closed to accrual. And so you would get an access to every clinical trial that is open, and those are the ones you really want to see. It doesn't help you to find out what was opened a month ago. You want to see what happens in real time. Within the US and internationally, you are not allowed to conduct drug studies without putting your study on clinicaltrials.gov. For drug studies that we currently have here, where I function or another investigator functions as the principal investigator, it is our responsibility to update this website periodically when the study closes, when the study goes on hold, when it's suspended. When you have new data that's submitted, you go on the website and you give that information as well. The website will provide you with inclusion and exclusion criteria. It can be overwhelming. For those of us who use it daily, it's simple to get through, and so certainly in the doctor's office, you could easily just quickly go through it. So if we look at soft tissue sarcomas, there are not many drugs that are considered to be FDA approved, and that becomes a little bit difficult. And so if you just do a Google search of FDA approved drugs for sarcoma, it pulls up 4 drugs. Dactinomycin, which is rarely to never used, doxorubicin, which is always used and almost every patient would have it, imatinib, which is really only used for GI stromal tumors, and pazopanib, which is the last drug that got approved, going on 2 years, which is the first targeted therapy that was approved for sarcomas and is approved for all sarcomas except for liposarcomas. There are drugs that we commonly use, and most of you have either heard of these names or been on these drugs. Those include ifosfamide, dacarbazine, gemcitabine, taxotere, paclitaxel, vincristine, temozolomide, and then drugs that are targeted like sorafenib and Sutent. So these are all drugs that are currently on the market, drugs that are routinely used. Aside from sorafenib and Sutent, most of the other ones are relatively easy to get for the indication of a soft tissue sarcoma. And when I say easy to get, we could always administer. What we do is we need the insurance companies to agree. And the way most insurance companies work is they look closely at the NCCN guidelines and what the panels do for recommendations. And all of these drugs are listed as recommended for patients with soft tissue sarcomas. So what's exciting is that there are a number of drugs that are soon to be coming to market, or hopefully coming to market. The first one that potentially will have a new indication for soft tissue sarcoma is Yondelis, which my understanding is we should find out on October 24th if the FDA will approve it. It's a drug that's approved around the world, except in the US, for soft tissue sarcomas. The approval here in the United States will likely be for liposarcoma and leiomyosarcomas, but once you have an initial approval, then it becomes a little bit easier to use it across the board for other tumor types. It's an IV chemotherapy. If it gets approved on October 24th, drugs should be available for patients as early as October 26th is what I'm told. And so that's the first thing that will be very exciting. Eribulin is a second drug that's currently FDA approved. It's approved for breast cancer therapy, and studies that came out a few months ago looked at it for overall survival and showed that it improved survival for patients as a third-line therapy if you had liposarcoma or leiomyosarcoma. Because the drug is already FDA approved, it is already in NCCN guidelines, so it is something that is easy enough to acquire for patients. And so there are a number of patients over the last several months that have been started on Eribulin. Ifosfamide is a drug that was extensively studied in a phase 3 clinical trial. Very promising results from phase 2 clinical trial. The phase 3 clinical trials would anticipate to show just as promising results, and this too is going to the FDA. This would be given in conjunction with adriamycin as a first-line therapy for patients who have never had any chemotherapy, and it should be able to improve patient survival compared to using the adriamycin by itself. At the same time, olaratumab is a drug that we've worked, so the evofosfamide, all of these drugs actually, we've run clinical trials. There's potentially patients here who have had these drugs. The Yondelis and Eribulin trials were trials from several years back. The evofosfamide trial was just a few years ago, and we currently are still running olaratumab trials. This is a very interesting compound. The data for it was presented at ASCO this year, which is our national meeting. And it showed a profound survival advantage for patients who receive it with adriamycin. And so we've used it extensively here. It's used as a single agent or in combination. And this too will either go to a large phase 3 clinical trial, or it will go right to the FDA for approval, and one doesn't know what will happen yet. Aldoxorubicin is another drug that we are currently conducting phase 3 clinical trials in. A number of you have either been participant or been offered this clinical trial, and it is a sister compound to adriamycin without some of the toxicities. So hopefully the information from this phase 3 trial will work, and this could be another drug that will come to market. This will likely not go to an FDA or anything for several years still, but it certainly is something that's exciting in the pipeline. And GPX150 is the last drug that is again looking at first-line agent. It's a sister drug again to adriamycin, and it too is looking to make headway and make an impact in the sarcoma world. So certainly, I wanted to have this slide up. So with respect to asking questions, comments, those of you who are our patients obviously have access to us. Those of you who aren't our patients, if you have questions or concern, you could certainly reach out to us. There is an information flyer that you've been given as well. It did leave out 1 or 2 names, so I apologize ahead for that, but calling any of our offices will get you to the right people. And Sarah Duffy, who is sitting somewhere, she was sitting somewhere, so she's in charge of working in our cancer research office for clinical trial recruitment and an education specialist, and someone could reach out to her if you have questions about clinical trial enrollment. So without a doubt, the group of us who have spoken tonight and those who didn't have a chance to speak tonight certainly have an incredible amount of job satisfaction, and it really is a reflection of all of you who continue to come and see us and challenge us and certainly share with us, and hopefully you get to know us very well over the course of the time that you come and spend time in our office. A few housekeeping things to mention. One, you all get or have a patient